All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first session of our new series with Mark Schenker. It's going to be great. I hope you had a chance to read the story for today. It was really good. And the whole series concept, I think you're going to find very interesting. Um, I'm Michael Bellicosa. I'm the head of adult programming here at the library, which means I get to put all these programs together and work with great partners like Mark to bring these things to you. I want to also thank the generosity of the family of Amy Quigley, because all of our literary seminars and series are made possible with the generosity of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. A couple of quick things. As usual, we'll use the Q&A function in order for you to pass along comments or questions, which I will relay to Mark. The other thing is we're recording this, so you'll have a recording link, as well as other folks that maybe couldn't be here live right now, a recording link sent within a few days in order to be able to watch this again. And I just want to briefly go through Mark's bio, and I won't do it on the other sessions, but for people who might be here for the first time that may not know Mark yet. So Mark Schenker, having served in various decanal roles at Yale College since 1990, he retired last year. Former lecturer in the English department, he received his Ph.D. from Columbia University with a concentration in 19th century and early 20th century English literature. He has taught previously at Columbia, NYU, Trinity College in Hartford. Outside of academia, Mark has for over 35 years lectured on literature and film, and has led book discussion series in more than 100 venues in Connecticut, including public libraries, museums, and cultural centers. He also conducts monthly sessions for a number of private reading groups in the state. In 2001, he received the Wilbur Cross Award for Outstanding Humanities Scholar, presented by the Connecticut Humanities Council. Pretty solid resume, and as usual, we've been working with Mark for several years now on these, and it's always a big hit and a very impressive presentation on whichever topics we came up with. And the short stories by women idea was largely Mark's inspiration. After we did the plays, the comic plays from the British playwrights, who we realized were all men, decided to do a series that were all short fiction by all by women. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark. One other quick note. You may notice that the way we set this up, the first 3 sessions are going to be in the evening, on Tuesday evenings like this. And the last 3 sessions are going to be in person at the library with Mark here. We will point the camera at him, so if you can't get here, you'll still be able to watch it. And of course, we will also have a recording. But for those 3 sessions, Mark's going to be here. And that's going to be on Tuesdays, but in the afternoon at 3 o'clock. So I'll be asking you in the next few weeks or so about whether you intend to come to the library, so I can plan for the right room and all of that. And otherwise, now I've spoken too much. I'll turn this over to Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you to you and the library and the fund for making this possible. Let me say that listening to my own biography, which doesn't please me, that Wilbur Cross Award from 2001 should probably be retired. That's getting on to being a lifetime ago, and maybe I haven't done anything memorable since. I will say that when Michael introduces me, I'm always relieved when he says this is going to be a great session, because then a great series, because then I feel like I don't have to worry. So yes, we chose short stories by women because last year's program, by default, doing great British stage comedies from the Renaissance to 21st century, almost necessarily had to be all men. I picked coming of age for reasons I'll explain now. Coming of age is a very common theme. One reason to do it is it's largely universal. Sometimes it has a ritual or sacramental or religious or tribal connection. A particular sect or group identifies itself by how people come of age. It allows the author partly to write a veiled autobiography because many of coming of age stories, including tonight's, are partly based on the author's own experience. It's not written as autobiography, it's written as fiction, but it's very much flavored by autobiography. So those are all good reasons to do it. Moreover, most literary fiction is about some relationship between an individual and his or her society. And one of the most common interactions is to join that society, to come of age, either because you marry or you become an adult or you pass some kind of uh, test, either formal or informal. And by passing it, you become a member of that society. There are coming of age novels where the event is a war, like The Red Badge of Courage or All Quiet on the Western Front. They are most typically coming of age stories of men because this is the way the world has worked. Many, many stories about Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, Harry Potter, young men who come of age in different ways. But there's a long line, especially in the 19th century, of important female coming of age stories from Jane Eyre and Emma and Anne of Green Gables, Little Women, which is a kind of joint coming of age. Their Eyes Were Watching God, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which we did in a series here at Wilton before. And it adds another dimension of female coming of age because, in general, the obstacles that the protagonist has to overcome as a female are often more daunting than they are for men. So that's just a brief overview. We will be doing short stories by a New Zealander tonight, by several Americans, by a Chinese American, Maxine Hong Kingston. The story is No Name Woman, and by an Irish writer, Claire Keegan. So there's variety there. The last thing I want to say in terms of setting up this story, it was published in 1922. She was never healthy and she died the following year as a 33 or 34-year-old woman. And she knew that she was living on borrowed time. The characters in the story are very much based, the Sheridans, on her family. And she did have two older sisters and a younger brother. The younger brother's name was Leslie, Lie. So you see, she worked that into Laurie. She's obviously, if you know anything about Catherine Mansfield, a version of the Laura, the artistic one, the one who likes to arrange things. And she did have two older sisters. One thing I need to make you aware of, which you may remember from others of our conversations, is the 1920s in America and especially England and parts of Europe became a time for writers to engage in the First World War, either directly, like All Quiet on the Western Front or Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, or more typically indirectly. So the 1925 novel, like The Great Gatsby, is partly about the First World War. The violence in that novel, the rootlessness of the characters, is partly a reflection of post-war trauma. Mrs. Dalloway, which is far removed from the war as we might think, also a 1925 novel, has a shell-shocked veteran named Septimus Smith who commits suicide. If you didn't know that because you haven't read the book, I recommend you read the book anyways. It won't affect your enjoyment. But that was very common for there being a kind of detour, a kind of projection of the trauma of war onto a story that's not about the war. So the young man, father of five, who's lying in a box or a bed that Laura sees, much to her chagrin, uh, is a victim of the war. You understand that he's not technically, but this story would be read by people who would read about this senseless, it's an accident, no one did it on purpose, killing, which serves a purpose in the story, but would also be a memento mori, a reminder of death. And people in New Zealand or England, she lived in both places, or America, could not read a well-written story in 1922 with a young man killed senselessly, So it's not an execution, it's not a murder, it's not disease, without thinking of the war. I think it's important that you know that. As it happens, her younger brother Leslie died at the age of 21 in 1915, serving in the First World War, but at home in a grenade throwing exercise that took his life. And it devastated her. And the story's partly channeling her great affection to him. You see how important he is early in the story, even though his lines are few, and then in the kind of coming out of the bushes surprise appearance at the end. Two very close people, and his support of her mattered both in the story and in her life. So I told Michael before we started that I like to think that this is a very accessible story, that the readers of Wilton Library won't need a lot of help from me. I'm not looking to coast, I'm not looking to turn it all over to you, but it's very clear that Laura is a product of a certain kind of class distinction that she wants to think she is keeping at a distance, but it's in her blood. And she cares about that hat, and she cares about the workmen not judging her because she's holding bread and butter, and she doesn't like it when they treat her like a little kid, and she realizes that when she greets them she unconsciously channels her mother's voice, and she doesn't like that. She admires that the tall young man, seems affable, and that he takes time to smell the roses, as it were. And she wishes that the boys, that is, the young men, we can think of her as a teenager. She's certainly the youngest of the three daughters, but she's old enough to be thinking about boys as people to at least date. She wishes the men she knew were more like the working men. So all that's obvious in the beginning, and then the story gives her a kick in the teeth by having the working class come into her life. There's this separation of the Sheridan mansion up on the hill and the descent into a kind of Hades when she's sent with the basket, like Little Red Riding Hood, into the dark forest, and the language that describes the smoke, the chocolate brown houses, the cabbage stalks. It's a kind of wasteland. That would also be a reminder to the readers of what they read about no man's land in the First World War, that soldiers in the trenches in France were confronted by a kind of horrific scene that's not unlike the description of this working camp. It's not a camp, they're houses, but we're told that the smoke that comes out of those chimneys is radically different from the silvery gray that comes out of the rich homes. So that should get all that off the table. We should save our energy and time by not underscoring the obvious, and let's concentrate on what makes this story, given that very clear class consciousness and her takeaway, what makes it so remarkable. And we want to make sure we spend some time unpacking the ending, that cryptic exchange between sister and brother. So, Michael, I'm going to take it over to you because I'm hoping most of the conversation will be from our readers.
Okay, Mark. Well, folks, you know the drill. It's the Q&A box. It can be questions, it could be comments, it could be reactions.
I'll say, as we're waiting, that some of you may know the excellent novel by D.H. Lawrence, Women in Love. The one of the women who's in love, the one who doesn't wind up with the D.H. Lawrence character, is named Gudrun, Gudrun. Lawrence based that character on Catherine Mansfield, who was one of his circle.
One thing that I found interesting reading this is that, this is not an earth-shattering observation, but that you can read this in a completely straightforward, reality-based way about people putting a party together and then having an incident occur that kind of disrupts the flow, but also in a very metaphorical way when you mentioned going down the hill and into the underworld, there's there's a little bit of Persephone myth in there of descending and coming back out. So there's ways of looking at reading this. Is very, as we said earlier, Mark, before we started, that it's a very accessible story, but it's also readable on a bunch of different levels.
Right. And it also is capable of analysis of art. So you may know that there are a number of sentences in the first section. I call the first section when she's outside talking to the men about the marquee before she goes inside to deal with the flags on the sandwiches and the cream puffs and other things. In that first section, there are a number of sentences that are said as if they're being said by the narrator, but we know they're being said by Laura. That's something I've talked about before in Wilton. It's called the free indirect style. It's when we're in someone's head, but there are no quotation marks. There are no markers like she thought. So when it says something like, how friendly workmen could be after all, period, that's an example of the free indirect style. It is a sentence that is in Laura's voice or head that is not marked that way. I'll give you an example. A man is riding home on a train. He steps off the train at the station, and the narrator seems to say he would visit his uncle as soon as possible. That's not a prediction. That's the character's thought. He has decided in being in the depot that this is something he will do. And when we read it, we hear that sentence. He would visit his uncle as soon as possible. That's the free indirect style. Free because it has no markers that it's this person thinking. It was perfected by Flaubert, but it's used as early as Jane Austen and others. And the value of it is it gets the author and the busyness of quotation marks and he said, he thought, he wondered out of the way. It lets Laura, in this first section, partly tell her own story by having her mind come directly to us.
So I've got a pair of questions from Sarah, and I'll give you them both because maybe they're intertwinable. Her first comment was so much here reminds me of Mrs. Dalloway. Was there an influence there? And the second one that she put a few minutes later after that was, could you talk about modernism and what are some examples?
Yeah, the second question, who's the questioner?
Sarah.
Sarah, I appreciate both questions. The second question is probably too big for this talk unless you're one of the few people who's going to give me questions tonight, so we'll see. But I can answer the first one. It's not so much influence, it's confluence. It's not so much that one comes from the other, but they're cognates, they're cousins. That is, Virginia Woolf came from the same class as Catherine Mansfield, and she had the same sense of class entitlement being both an access to better understanding the world, but a bar to her empathy with other people from their point of view. And although she wasn't ill the way Catherine Mansfield was and did not die young, she was plagued by mental illness and took her life before she died of anything else. It does have the same sense of putting on a party because that's the event in Mrs. Dalloway. That's the central event. There isn't the issue of mother and daughters or parents and children, but there is the sense that when the doctor comes to report that his patient, who we know is Septimus Smith, Clarissa Dalloway has not known him, but we've been spending time with him. When he announces at her party that one of his patients has taken his own life, her first reaction is to go upstairs into a room of her own and treat it as if somebody spilled red wine on the carpet. Her first response is as a society matron, which is part of what Virginia Woolf was. And in the same way, Mrs. Sheridan, when she told there was an accident, says, not in the garden. I mean, the first thing she wants to know is, did somebody essentially spill wine on my carpet? It's not because one of them is being influenced by the other. They're cut from the same cloth, which is not class consciousness, but class consciousness and sensitivity. Both these female authors are smart enough to write in and outside of that bias. I hope that helps, Sarah. And if there's time, I'll be glad to say some things about modernism.
So this is from Kathy. Another two-part question. The children were to be in charge of the garden party, but their mother ended up taking over. What was the symbolism of this? And number two, there was only a little paragraph about the party. Why is that?
Okay, so the first question, I hope this answer is satisfying to you. Have you met wealthy, powerful, opinionated women? There's no symbolism in this. She wants her children to do the work until she doesn't. She wants them to go up this instant, she says to several of her daughters. She wants them to take care of the marquee, to take care of the flags until she has a strong opinion. And when it comes down to whether or not they're calling off the party, doesn't matter that the children have opinions. She's the mom. She is a society mom. She's a wealthy woman. This is a family like Catherine Mansfield's own family, which were called the Beauchamps, who is very prominent in their area. That's the way such people are. That's the answer to that question. What was the second part of that? Oh, the garden. So that's the point of it. You read a story called The Garden Party. You read the first 8, 10, 12 paragraphs. You get down to the flowers. You get down to the cream puffs, the flags on 16 kinds of sandwiches, and you think this is going to be an entire story about a big deal party. It's not about that. That's all setting the stage for, and then something happened. And the thing that happens is the crux of the story. That's the genius of Catherine Mansfield. Nobody reading this story for the first time could predict that event of the accident, and certainly not her response to it. The art of the story is partly that Laura, who's artistic, which is to say sensitive, she's not just good at arranging, she has empathy. She's the one who feels most for the accident's victim. She's the one who has the courage to go down. I mean, think about, even if she's as old as 17 or 18, I'm not sure she is, but even if she were, how are they in their right mind sending this girl down to an area that's not welcoming, at least on site, to deal with a family that's grieving about an accident that happened on their property? How are they not sending Sadie or the cook or Lori or dad or two other sisters? Why are they sending her alone? That seems almost cruel. And the insight of recognizing that Laura loves that hat and then is abashed that she has it on, her wishing she had thought to put something over her fancy party dress, her not winning the argument that the basket of leftovers will seem insulting rather than generous. Those are all really fine details of an excellent writer. I hope you agree. I hope, if anyone's disagreeing with any of this, if anyone thinks this isn't as accomplished a story as I think it is, please speak up. I'd love to hear it. That's not a challenge, it's an invitation.
So I've got another comment. This one's just has to be anonymous because it just says iPad, but that's okay. So following on the comment about modernism, is it fair to say that Mansfield's attention to detail, the au bourgeois details of the party, precise and each with a little meandering side story, is it fair to say that these are telltale signs of modernism?
Well, I'll say by default what I will say about modernism. Modernism is a movement in England, America, and Western Europe that largely is writers operating between the two world wars. So typically, you have to be born at the end of the 19th century and writing stories between the First and Second World War. And the crux of modernism is it's what happens when artists, intellectuals, philosophers, cultural critics believe that progress has gotten so far advanced technologically that culture has lost sight of what matters. So Hemingway is a modernist, and tries to go back to the basics of bullfighting, fishing, and hunting. The Great Gatsby is a tale of modernism where the problem of automobile culture and a very violent book, which is partly channeling the First World War, thinks that human relations have been debased. Many works of modernism look back to the past to try to get in touch with earlier examples of humanity. So T.S. Eliot writes The Wasteland, a great modern poem in the 20th century, 1922, right around the time the story is coming out. And he bases it on ancient vegetative myths. James Joyce writes his great masterpiece about modernism, another book that channels the First World War. Ulysses takes place before the war, but it is filled with a post-World War I mentality. He bases it on an epic from the ancient world. Pablo Picasso goes back to Africa to find something primal and powerful in those ancient myths. The Rite of Spring is based on fertility myths because the culture is saying we have to slow down, and our salvation is not in technology, but in understanding our humanity. And so modernism is always fundamentalist, that is going back to first things. With respect to this story, the modernist touch is that almost every paragraph has something that purports to be a marker of class, just a description of this kind of world and how many sandwiches and when's the last time you had to meet a florist with dozens and dozens of flowers. How often have you had to think where to put up the marquee in your backyard? What makes the story modernist is alongside or within those mundane things. They may be interesting, but they're matter of fact. It's revealing character. The way Laura debates whether it's fun to be able to eat bread and butter outside. Her parents, especially her mother, don't let her do that because it's not a thing that a society girl should do. You shouldn't be being seen outside eating something, let alone bread and butter. And the way she shifts her reaction when she points at something, she makes sure to use the hand that doesn't have bread and butter. That's the richness of modernism. That is alongside the necessary description of sandwich flags and cream puffs and the marquee are these touches of character. When she catches herself in the mirror, instead of being self-reflective, which is her nature, she's being self-admiring, and on and on and on. That's what makes this story modernist.
Got it. So Liz, to follow up on the concept of the details, Liz is saying, I would have to say that the details were quite poignant. I couldn't help but think that finger sandwiches and cream puffs were feeble help to a family that had just lost their husband, father, breadwinner, their future. Were they meant to have a little party and then move on?
Right. And of course, that's the mother's insensitivity. Laura is smart enough to know that at first, but she's also her mother's daughter. That is, she's not going to challenge her mother. And there's a part of her that's bred from the same gene pool. There's a part of her that maybe wants to be Lady Bountiful. There's no doubt that the big basket is an image of the innocent going into the forest with a big bad wolf. Here, the big bad wolf is death. And the rite of passage here is about confronting death in the context of the garden party in your home. The garden party takes place in the manor house's backyard, and the back of the backyard is this tenement of these workers at the foot of the hill. All perfectly realistic. You could imagine that that accident could happen. You could imagine that such a place could be side by side with a rich house on the hill. It's not symbolism, it's not strained, and it's not neat because at the end of the story, when her brother shows up, having gone down to look after her, which you would hope he would have done earlier, it's not clear exactly what the takeaway is. There's a lot of not speaking, a lot of language without obvious meaning, which is another aspect of modernism, a kind of intimation. But I think most readers who admire the story enjoy the detail that's given about the roses and the trees that she doesn't want blocked and what they do to sweep the lawn, and what they do that little Hans, who's Leslie, her brother in real life, has to sweep the marks out of the carpet from where the furniture has been moved. I have two aunts now long deceased who would hate to see a mark on a carpet from where the preparation for a dinner had been, and would be down on their knees if they had to get those marks out. I'm not saying that's good work for women to do, but it certainly reflects a kind of attention to domestic detail that I think many people in this Zoom room are familiar with.
Great. So Maria comments that I love her writing style. The green bushes bowed down as though they had been visited by archangels, and the perfect afternoon slowly ripened, slowly faded, slowly its petals closed. These, among other lovely passages, is just beautiful writing.
Yes, Michael, let me just interrupt to ask you for a time check from my knowledge.
Coming up on 25 to 8.
Okay, good. So who just made that comment?
Maria.
Maria, let me say also that if you put yourself in the position of the people in the story, especially Laura, or of the author of the story, Catherine Mansfield, writing in 1920s, even leaving out that she had a brother killed in military action, even though he wasn't overseas. Think about how the tension between your beloved home, garden, flowers, sandwiches, furniture, how that represents one thing, and the nightmare of what the young men were facing, not very far away. Those soldiers who went to France, when they were on leave, they came back across the English Channel and they were furloughed on their vacations in England. And then they went back to the front. This is not on the other side of the world. And it was very much a class war in that most of the officers, many of whom were killed, were men of this class and this generation, and whole towns were wiped out of their young men before the British military and then the US military had the sense to separate men from the same town and sprinkle them across different divisions. But in the First World War, if a group of men in Regiment B went into battle and were annihilated, it's very likely it happened. I've read this. This is not something I'm just saying anecdotally, that you'd have a village in England that would have no men alive in their 20s or teens. So the adulation of the countryside, the garden, the cultivation of a garden. I mean, what is a garden but nature cultivated? Under it is the awareness of the reader, the contemporary reader, and certainly of Mansfield, of what was happening in France.
Got it. Okay. Someone is asking, what is meant by the adjective oily of the person who led Laura into the house of the man who tragically died?
Well, the polite word to use that has a different meaning would be when someone's unctuous. Who asked that question?
I don't know, because it was just an
Okay.
iPhone.
Whoever asked it, I say to you, but of course you're not on the record for this. You may know the word unctuous, which comes from oil. Those of you who know about extreme unction, the last rites, it's the last putting on of oil, the anointing with oil. Unctuous means oily in the sense of phonily helpful and compliant. Uriah Heep in David Copperfield is an unctuous man. It's an insult. It's somebody who is so lubricated with pretending to want to help you that they're off putting. Here it means something more straightforward because Catherine Mansfield and even probably Laura is capable of using the word unctuous, but an oily person is just that. to a well-coiffed, cleaned woman of a certain rank in society, poor people are greasy. And it's not an accident that petticoats and kimonos and curls on girls' cheeks, and that we meet the girls when they're still in their toilette. That's not an accident. And mother telling Laura what to tell Kitty to wear to the party, and that looks so adorable. That's the world of the Sheridans. But the women and men in the tenement, I'll use that as a shorthand, they're going to be literally greasy because the hygiene is a different issue. They're probably living in one room or few room houses where the smell and um, smoke of the meat frying in the skillet suffuses the entire home. And I, we don't have to be graphic, but any of you who've had occasion to work with very poor people often know that their homes have a smell of cooking, not because we don't cook too, but because they live in cramped quarters or they're not as sensitive to what you can do to remove that. So it quite literally means that the woman is greasy, is oily.
Got it. Okay, so Jean is commenting when the main character goes down to the house with the dead guy with her basket, she is treated very cordially by the family. It doesn't seem she experiences any hostility for being one of the rich people. This suggests Mansfield is sympathetic to them. Then they have her view the body, which is important to the coming of age plot. But is this in any way a hostile act? Take that polite rich person, here's our reality. I think not. I think they're just being inclusive, which is part of Mansfield's viewing them as good people. I think the young woman was not expecting that level of intimacy.
Right. So this is my friend Gene, I'm imagining. I could be wrong, but I think
Yes.
it,
Yes.
and I will say that not surprisingly, he answers his own question very well. That's not a shot. You raise a good question and you answer it the same way I would. They are flattered that the rich people on the hill, remember, they're neighbors. They must have interactions in terms of passing on the road. It's very likely that in past times, the people on the hill have sent something down to the people in the tenement. They are actually honored that the young miss has come, and they probably don't mind at all that she's dressed in finery with a fancy hat. And of course, they're going to want her to see the body because that's what one does when you come to visit the grieving home of a widow or a relative of the dead. They're not doing it as their look. You thought you'd be Lady Bountiful. I'm going to make you suffer by having you see the dead body. To them, this is their beloved brother, uncle, son, husband, and they are quite sincere. It's something quite different for Laura. And if you were to reread the portion of the story from when she meets the people in the tenement to the very end, you see how delicate it is to convey how um, terrible and dark and unpleasant the place is, but how much in that context the people are trying to do the right thing socially, treating her kindly, getting out of her way, of course, inviting her to come in to witness the body. That's what people do when you visit the home of grieving people. It's very delicately handled in the prose of Catherine Mansfield.
Okay. So, hi from Daniel. I really love the wrap up where her brother says, quote, isn't it? The way he's finishing her thought and bringing his sister back to the top of the hill and not letting her linger too long in the sad depths of the nightmare that she is just emerging from.
Yeah. So even without knowing that that brother is channeling her beloved brother in real life, who has been dead for 7 years at the time the story is published, even just allowing that in a family with a strong mother, a father who seems not to have much to do in this story, he may be a quite lovely father, he might even be a strong father, but the mother seems to be the head of the household for the girls, and allowing that there are three older girls and one younger brother, the story is loaded with female culture. And the thing about Laurie, who shares his name with Laura, is that there seems to be, from the brief interaction early and late in the story, a special connection between Laurie and Laura. In her real life, Mansfield was the next oldest, closest in age to her brother. In the story, Laurie is a kind of grown up. He's maybe the oldest of the siblings, but that interaction with uh, rather and all the Britishisms that Laurie uses in talking to his sister about making his suit look a little better, and he uses I'm forgetting the other one. He calls us something that's clearly a Britishism, and it's just part of his natural style. And it's clear that they're very close. And it's not surprising that he goes down to check on her. In my own imagined reading of the story, I think it's more likely that he heard belatedly from his mother or sisters that they sent Laura down, and he decided on his own to go down because probably his mother would have thought that was unnecessary. It's possible you could read the story your own way and think that the father or the mother sent the brother down. I think that's unlikely. So I think he decided to split the difference and go, but go late and hold off because he himself probably was not comfortable with entering that environment. And he certainly wouldn't have handled it with the kind of equilibrium that Laura does. But then I'd like to ask, and Michael, do you have the story in front of you? Michael?
I got stuck on mute for some reason. No, I have the story, but it's on a tab. You want me to look something up?
No, I want you to read the section of the conversation at the end, if you're willing, just in the interest of time, not to look for volunteers. If you would read slowly the exchange between brother and sister at the very end.
Okay, let's see.
I do it, but my eyes don't work right.
Okay, just the last few sentences.
From when he shows up at the end.
Okay, uh, he stepped out of the shadow. Is that you, Laura? Yes. Mother was getting anxious. Was it all right? Yes, quite. Oh, Laurie. She took his arm. She pressed up against him. I say, you're not crying, are you? Asked her brother. Laura shook her head. She was. Laurie put his arm around her shoulder. Don't cry, he said in his warm, loving voice. Was it awful? No, sobbed Laura. It was simply marvelous. But Laurie, she stopped. She looked at her brother. Isn't life, she stammered, isn't life? But what life was, she couldn't explain. No matter, he quite understood. Isn't it, darling? Said Laurie.
Right. So when he says, was it all right? And the answer comes back, uh, yes, quite. Um, another Britishism. This is classic British, and although they're living in New Zealand, the Mansfield family, the Beauchamp, they're of English extraction. She spent a great deal of her time in England and London. This is the understatement where he understands enough about life that he knows that it would have been hard on her. He also knows that she's made of stern stuff, and that when she says, no, it was all right, and continues, it's clear that she's upset and she's crying. And she realizes, or he realizes, that when she says it's not horrible, she has had a coming of age moment. She has learned something about life because she's the artistic one. She is not just a typical girl of her class and age. She is Laura Sheridan. She is Catherine Mansfield. And when she says in crying that she understands something, she can't put it into words because that's the nature of a true insight. And he gets that too, which is why we know they are so closely connected. And Michael, if you wouldn't mind again, just read the last exchange, sister and brother, the very last words of each. Perhaps Michael's muted again. I don't want to try to remember it since it's so delicate, but the point is they
I
come.
got it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, no, sobbed Laura. It was simply marvelous. But Laurie, she stopped. She looked at her brother. Isn't life, she stammered, isn't life? But what life was, she couldn't explain. No matter. He quite understood. Isn't it, darling? Said Laurie.
Yeah. So what's emphasized there is their closeness, not just what they're agreeing on, but she is his little dear, which is what darling means. And they're very close. And it's not just that what life is ineffable. This has just happened. And this teenage girl has had an insight that life is fill in the blank, and no adjective you use is going to be sufficient. Isn't life extraordinary? Isn't life challenging? Isn't life surprising? Life is life and death. Life is bread and butter sandwiches and uh, um, flags on sandwiches and beautiful lilies and cream puffs that everybody knows you get from this one place, and dressing up and wearing a hat. It's all those things. And it's also a recognition that it's unfair. It's recognition that death can come in a moment. In Mrs. Dalloway, which was wisely invoked by one of our readers earlier, one of the lines in that magnificent book is Mrs. Dalloway knew how very dangerous it was to live even one day. That's a quote early in the novel. Mrs. Dalloway knew what a dangerous thing it was to live even one day. Woolf is not talking about the First World War. She's talking about people in London. She's talking about people everywhere. It's dangerous to live even one day because crap happens. To you, you can be killed. An accident can happen and you can be witness to something heartbreaking. Virginia Woolf knew that. Clarissa Dalloway knows it, and now Laura Sheridan knows it. Isn't life complicated? Isn't life bread and butter sandwiches and a man killed senselessly in a traffic accident in a driveway? I mean, he's not run down on an interstate. Um, and the fact that they don't say it shows you how ineffable, how incapable of expressing it is. But their love for each other is in the moment of understanding. She wants his agreement and she gets it. And the last word of the story is darling, because that relationship matters. And if you add to that the overlayer that this is partly an homage to her dead brother, it becomes quite poignant.
Got it. Janet's comment is, for me, the crux of the story is Laura's epiphany of feeling empathy and caring awareness of the working class people living next to her.
Yeah, and of course, that's the great gift of literature to teach us what it is to be other people. Michael, I hope this isn't irksome, but can you tell me the time now?
Yeah, it's about 10 to 8.
Okay. I want to make sure I leave 5 minutes to introduce No Name Woman without giving the plot away. So we'll take another question or comment from someone or from you, and then I'll turn to next time's reading.
Okay, well, here's a comment from Lori. As a
Wait,
modern woman,
ending?
Lori, yes.
Oh my goodness.
As a modern woman, I was struck by the pettiness of most of the female characters, Meg, Jose, Mrs. Sheridan, though not Laura in most ways. in contrast with the quiet heroism and depth of the male characters, such as the main workman in his shirt sleeves, Laurie, the big brother, the dead man. Do you suppose this was intentional?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by this. You mean,
I think she probably means portraying many of the female characters as petty and the men not so.
yeah. Well, I'm not sure I would give the men so much credit. We don't see enough of Laurie to know. And also, he's a good deal older, and it seems clear that he's working in business. He's a grown up. The girls, Meg, and I think she's pronounced Josie, and Laura, who are based on the names from Little Women. Um, Catherine Mansfield adored Louisa May Alcott's Little Women. I gave it earlier as an example of a group coming of age story. I myself wouldn't characterize that the girls are petty in a way that needs to be rebuked. They are young women who have been bred to be uh, among abundance. They're used to such things. And I could give examples from my own upbringing, which was much more truly impoverished. And I could say that I was petty when I was not happy that my serving from my foster mother didn't have as much garlic bread as my cousin got across the table. I wasn't born to the manor, but I like getting my share of garlic bread. But it didn't make me a terrible person. These are girls who are filled with the life they live, and no one is correcting them. Not Laurie, the older brother, not the mother. This is who they are. Laura is destined for different things because she's the artistic one, because she's a version of Catherine Mansfield. And it's certainly true it is better not to be petty than petty. But these girls are who they are. And I don't think the story is spending a lot of energy castigating them. For one thing, the sensibility of the narrative voice describing the landscape of the garden is someone who loves beauty and nature, abundance. It's someone from a class. When she talks about the trees not being blocked by the marquee, that's not making fun of Laura. One of the things such people do is they like the beauty of nature. So I hope that doesn't seem too much of a corrective. It's hard to know what Laurie would have been like as a much younger man, but in this novel, in this short story, he's the father figure. We first see him with his father. The father's a non-entity, basically, and it is the two businessmen, the two working men at least, who we see side by side. So I'm going to take a break now and make a very brief introduction to No Name Woman. It is the first story in a collection of stories by Maxine Kong Kingston called Woman Warrior. In Woman Warrior, the main story in that volume, Mulan,
Hey,
which was
Mark, hey,
created.
Mark, let me just interrupt you for a second. Isn't the next story, Where Are You Going? We can do No Name Woman if you want.
No, I'm pausing to think. Um, yes, where. Thank you for the correction. Thank you, Michael. This is why we have librarians. Um, so Joyce Carol Oates' story was a standalone story from the 1970s. Where are you going? Where have you been? Which is a coming of age story about a young woman who is left home alone by her own choice on a very hot day and encounters a male figure who may be sexually attractive but also a little scary. I would rather you read the story on its own terms, but if you want to investigate more after you read the story as you find it, you will find that the character, the male character, is based on someone who was an American criminal. But what I'd like you to think about is what is the relationship between how this young woman is described on this hot day in the countryside and her kind of fantasy and the reality she confronts? And what are we supposed to make about the way the story resolves? This is much more a coming of age, not about the discovery of death, but the discovery of sexuality. And Joyce Carol Oates is partly channeling Bob Dylan, whose lyrics, she thought, were magnificent poetry. And the song "It's All Over Now, Baby Blue," pack up your things and get out of here, inspired the thrust of the story. I will also tell you, if you enjoy reading it, they made a film version of it that you could probably get on YouTube, starring Laura Dern, a very young Laura Dern, as the central girl in the story. So, Where Are You Going? Where Have You Been? Is a coming of age story about a girl of sheltered background confronting sexual attraction in maybe a dangerous circumstance.
Sounds great. So I will just say, folks, I didn't say it at the beginning. Most of you know this. Since we did have a few questions at the end there that we didn't get to, questions, comments, Mark is always happy to have you email him directly. He always responds. And if you don't have his email address by this point, just let me know and I'll tell you what it is.
Very good. And I'll try to be as prompt as I can about that. And I promise to try to remember the order of the stories we're doing in the future.
And folks, pay attention to the dates because it looks like it's every other week, but there's I think a 3-week gap in the middle there. So just pay attention to the dates, but we'll see you in 2 weeks on April 8th.
Michael, how many people did we have this evening?
About 50.
I asked that not to do a head count for any purpose other than knowing how many people we have to manage in the Q&A. If anyone had a question that we didn't get to or occurs to you within a day or so, send it to me and I'll do my best to respond. Thank you all. And Michael, thanks to you and the library.
My pleasure. Thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Good
Bye-bye.
night.